This video is brought to you by Squarespace. In 1967, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was not just seen as a great Beatles album. For many, it became the great Beatles album. Then, over time, it became something even bigger than that. It became the album that changed everything. But over the years, the way people talked about it began to change. It was the greatest album of 1967, but is it still the greatest Beatles album now? To understand why Sgt. Pepper became so highly regarded in the first place, you have to go back to June 1967. This is the difficult part for modern listeners to recreate. Because today, the album is always there. Streaming, CD, vinyl, mono, stereo, remixes, Dolby Atmos, headphones, phone speakers. But in June 1967, this thing arrived in the world like an event. Between Revolver in August 1966 and June 1967, the Beatles had released just 2 new tracks. There was speculation about what they were doing and even that they'd broken up. And suddenly, there was this. It didn't look like a normal pop LP, and it didn't sound like one either. One of the most interesting things about reading the original newspaper and magazine reactions now is that they are not all simple praise. This contemporary review described the album as a bit perplexing on first hearing. Another, Virginia Ironside, writing in the Daily Express, called the music mysterious, meaningless, and beautiful as modern poetry. And that really tells you something. People were not hearing this simply as entertainment anymore. They were hearing it as something to be interpreted and decoded. Even Pete Townsend initially thought it was pretty fantastic, but also believed it was going to disappoint a lot of people. Others were not interested at all. Jeff Beck dismissed it completely as not being his kind of music. Sometimes we talk about Sgt. Pepper as though it arrived in 1967 and everybody instantly agreed that this was the future of music. But that's not really true. Some people were fascinated by it, others resisted it completely, and some were not even sure whether this was still really pop music anymore. And that to me is the key, because Sgt. Pepper was not only being judged as a set of songs, it was being judged as a statement, as an album that seemed to say, this is where pop music can go now. By the time Sgt. Pepper arrived, the Beatles had already moved far beyond the beat group format. Rubber Soul, and especially Revolver, had already changed expectations completely. What Pepper did differently was to tie all of that ambition together into a complete experience. The music, the artwork, the sequencing, even the presentation of the band itself, all became part of the experience. If you wanted a single album to explain why the Beatles had become so important culturally, this was the album you chose. And gradually, that idea became accepted almost as fact. It stopped being one of the greatest Beatles albums and became the greatest Beatles album. But by the 1970s, something else had started to happen. The world Sgt. Pepper came from was already beginning to feel dated.
Ringo, come back!
I thought I warned those guys.
What do you know? An abdominal snowman? Yeah.
Look out! A cliff!
I'm shutting my eyes.
Don't, or you'll miss this next message.
If you look at something like Sgt. Pepper, part of what made it feel so important in 1967 was presentation. And in a very different way, that's something Squarespace understands very well. Squarespace is an all-in-one platform that lets you build a website that feels cohesive and properly designed, rather than just a collection of disconnected pages. You can start with one of their award-winning templates, customize it using simple drag-and-drop tools, and shape everything around the kind of work you do. So whether you're building a blog, an online shop, a portfolio, or even an archive of your own work, Squarespace makes it easy to create something that feels clear, organized, and thoughtfully put together. And because things like hosting, mobile optimization, and updates are handled in the background, you can spend more time focusing on the content itself. So if you'd like to try it for yourself, go to squarespace.com for a 14-day free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Parlogram to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. By the time the Bee Gees' Sgt. Pepper film arrived in 1978, it was already being treated as something from another era. Meanwhile, albums like Revolver, The White Album and Abbey Road seemed to age differently. They didn't feel quite so tied to their time, and that gave them a different kind of durability. By the 1980s and the 1990s, you can already see that reassessment beginning. Sgt. Pepper is still near the top of lists and widely regarded as a masterpiece, but it's no longer completely unchallenged. Revolver starts appearing above it. The White Album develops a kind of cult status, while Abbey Road increasingly becomes the Beatles album people return to most often. I found an old 1987 CD review where the writer still called Sgt. Pepper his favourite album of all time, but then casually said, "Within Without You still sounds like a load of cack," which is funny, but also revealing. And by the late 1990s, magazines like Q were already ranking Revolver above Pepper. Now, I didn't hear Sgt. Pepper in 1967. Like most people, I came to it later. I first heard it in 1979 on this picture disc I bought with money I earned from picking potatoes on a local farm. And like most picture discs from that era, it didn't sound very good. But that didn't matter, because I was discovering this album as a complete experience, listening from beginning to end. And that's how Sgt. Pepper made sense to me. Years later, I had the chance to hear a 30 inches per second master tape at Abbey Road. And hearing the album that way completely changed the experience again. Suddenly, everything felt more present and real, but it was still the same record. And that's what I find interesting about Sgt. Pepper. The way you hear it can change enormously depending on the format, the environment, and the kind of attention you give it. When I played Sgt. Pepper to a group of younger listeners hearing the album for the first time, what stood out was not simply whether they liked it or disliked it, it was how they talked about listening to it.
But I feel like to be able to properly piece together some of the more intricate parts of the album, because I feel like there's so much I missed just from a first listen through. And I feel like because it was my first time listen, I couldn't process all of that at the same time.
Yeah, I think you would have to sit with it a bit, maybe. So it's a bit more demanding to listen to. So I actually don't know, even though I felt like it was one of my favorite albums for sure, but I don't know how soon I would listen to it again, to be honest.
I definitely liked a couple of songs on their own, but listening to the album as a whole, it was a little confusing with the jump between these different types of music.
Yeah, no, I think if I would have been a fan at that time and I would be waiting for their next album and I would have been really excited, I would have been a bit disappointed if I had listened to that. Not disappointed that it's not good, it's not what I would have expected. It's so different. And what happened?
I would send a therapist to check up on them.
As always, I kind of have this procedure of highlighting and marking songs from the playlist that stand out to me that I will add to my playlist immediately. This kind of album takes time to getting used to, and I think that's something that we cannot quite comprehend yet after only having listened to it once.
Okay, maybe I would pick out a few songs, but the whole album I'd find it very difficult. Maybe I just have to get used to it, but it was very overwhelming. Yeah.
These albums, they are so far away from what I've expected from the Beatles. I would have never guessed that they produced albums like this. Never in a million years.
And what's interesting about those reactions is that nobody was really dismissing the album. In fact, several of them clearly found it fascinating. But they also kept describing it as something you had to sit with, process and return to. And that's a very different listening experience from simply hearing a song and adding it to a playlist. because Sgt. Pepper was built around the idea that you would experience the album as a complete piece. And that's exactly the kind of listening that has become less common. And that tells you something important, because for a lot of listeners now, albums are no longer really the starting point. Songs are. Music is discovered track by track, shuffled into playlists, clipped into short videos and separated from its original context. And in that environment, Beatles music behaves very differently. What makes Sgt. Pepper different from albums like Revolver, The White Album or Abbey Road is that it depends much more heavily on being heard as a complete experience. Songs like Good Morning and With In Without You make much more sense inside the flow and atmosphere of the album than they necessarily do on their own. And that's really the key point. Sgt. Pepper was not trying to be a collection of standalone songs, it was trying to create a complete immersive experience. So, is Sgt. Pepper still the greatest Beatles album? Well, that depends on what you want from an album. But there's still nothing quite like Sgt. Pepper. The album hasn't really changed. We have. I'd really like to hear your own relationship with Sgt. Pepper now, especially if you first heard it decades ago, or if you came to it much later like I did. Do let me know in the comments. I'll be back next weekend with something different. But that's all for this one, so I'll say bye for now and thanks for watching.
Yeah.
I really liked this album.
Not my style.